Good morning, everybody. My name is Tyler Schafer. I'm an associate professor of sociology at Stan State. And today I'm going to be talking about some of my research and personal experiences related to community gardens. But first, I want to start out by thanking everybody who organized the event. I didn't want to leave this to the end. I usually end up rushing through the very end, the last few slides. So I want to make sure I thank everybody who was involved in making this happen. Gatherings like these, I think, are really important for building the kinds of relationships and social networks that help cultures of urban agriculture develop and thrive in communities like ours. I'm usually talking about this stuff exclusively with other sociologists, so it's really cool to be in a room that's full of people from such diverse fields and backgrounds and interests here today. So, like I said, I'm coming at this topic as a sociologist, and I think this quote does a nice job describing what that entails. So my research is much more about the community side of community gardens, but that doesn't mean that I'm uninterested in gardening. What that means is that my academic interest is really not so much about how people exercise optimal growing practices or things like that, but instead about how gardeners organize themselves, about how gardeners divide labor, how they assign meaning to the actions that they're taking in gardens, and how they develop norms and rituals together. So in my talk today, I want to make two major points. If you take anything away from this, I hope it's two things. One is what I believe to be the vital importance of the concept place in urban agriculture projects, and also to conceptualize community, not as a static category, but as practice, as an achievement, as action. Okay? So these are my two areas that I'm going to be talking about. I published a book about this research. I expand on a lot more other topics in there, but today, like I said, I'm going to focus on these two, what I think are essential points for us as people interested in urban agriculture. So I'm going to start briefly by describing how I came to study this topic. I was a graduate student at University of Nevada in Las Vegas, and I decided I wanted to grow my own veggies. I had zero background in this. I had no idea what I was doing, and I was very intimidated by Las Vegas's weather. So I got online, I looked around and found that there was a community garden that was really close to my house. I decided later that week to stop by and see if I could learn anything from the people that were gardening there. I got roped into coming back later that week to volunteer. Shortly thereafter, I was attending garden meetings. Then I was volunteering at garden events. And before I knew it, I was collecting data for my dissertation at the garden. So I ended up conducting 4 years of participant observation at the garden in a variety of roles as a member of the garden organization. I took copious field notes. I conducted 20 in-depth interviews with key volunteers at the garden. And I also analyzed all of the media coverage of the garden as it came out in Las Vegas. So the garden that I was working at and collecting data at was called the Tonopah Community Garden. It was on Tonopah Drive in Las Vegas. They eventually changed the name to Vegas Roots Community Garden. There's a town called Tonopah, Nevada, so people were really confused about whether it was actually in Vegas or Tonopah, so they changed the name. The garden was started by a woman named Rosalind Brooks. She's a Black Las Vegas native. She was looking for a career change, and her cousin owned property that he had just been using as a kind of scrapyard for his real estate business. So he agreed to donate the property to her temporarily to start a community garden. And so the garden was located on a 5-acre lot in a neighborhood known as the historic Black West Side in Las Vegas. And I'll describe this in more detail a little later. And like I said, I recently published a book about this. So if you have other questions about what I talk about today, I'm happy to talk much more about this. So you can see here, this is a before picture. This is after all the debris was moved over to one side of the property. That says 2008. That camera, you know how sometimes the date gets wrong. It's actually 2010. So you can see here architectural rendering of the plans for the garden space. And 4 years later, nearly all of those plans had been realized, and this is what we were left with. So at the end of my time at the garden, there were 36 raised beds. those allotment plots like Julie was talking about. 21 in-ground planting rows, as you can see here. A small permaculture test garden in the back. A vermiculture bin for growing worms and harvesting worms. 36 fruit and nut trees and 9 egg-laying hens. So these in-ground planting rows were planted year-round, and it served as a pick-it-yourself farmer's market where folks could come in and pick as they please, weigh it themselves, and pay based on an honor system. That worked well sometimes and not so well other times. The 36 raised bed plots, these were for rent, and in the early days of the garden, the initial volunteers determined that these plots would be rented for $500 a year. These are 10 by 10 plots. I heard some gasps. I did too when I first heard that. We'll come back to that later. A couple years after I left the garden site, the garden had received a pretty sizable grant, and you'll be glad to hear they reduced the price of the plots down to $350 a year. Yes. So, I entered the field, my research site, wanting to address or explore a pretty broad topic, and that was, how do people appropriate broad cultural trends like community gardening, these trends that exist out in the social world around us, into their local contexts? And again, I want to emphasize that today I'm focusing on two major things that I learned exploring this question. The first is the vital importance of place when we look at urban agriculture. Also, what I think is essential nature of approaching community, again, as an accomplishment, as a practice, as an ongoing achievement, not as something that's static to be tapped into or to be appropriated. Okay? So, in order to talk about place, I'm going to describe the context from which this garden grew. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the ecological realities of Las Vegas, the political context of the region, and also the socio-historical context. So Las Vegas is located in the Mojave Desert. The Mojave Desert has been facing an unprecedented decades-long drought. As you can see here in Lake Mead, where Las Vegas residents get 90% of their water, you can see the bathtub ring there that shows the old water levels. So they've been in crisis mode in Southern Nevada for years, worried about these water levels. So anybody engaged in urban agriculture in Las Vegas has to contend with the water issue and the ongoing indefinite drought. And a related issue, Southern Nevada has really bad soil for gardening in the ground. The soil science folks here will be way better at explaining this than I can, but Las Vegas has mostly what is called caliche for soil. It's almost like cement trying to get in it. You can see here a guy having to use a jackhammer to break up pieces of it. So this is not a very environmentally hospitable place for the kinds of gardening that you might think about here in Turlock. So the political context. Las Vegas is a kind of blue bubble in an otherwise very red state. But I think what's more telling about the political context in Las Vegas is that the entire state has a kind of libertarian streak that runs through it. So even in places like Las Vegas, there's a lot of skepticism about government intervention. There's a lot of hesitancy to embrace government programs or funding social services. This becomes a problem when fledgling organizations like a community garden are trying to negotiate with, for example, like the water agency. It's hard to get local residents behind lower rates or reduced rates for a project like this, especially if it's a project that they're not going to benefit from. So you have these kind of political issues that I believe are really important to grapple with as you're starting a project like this. So finally, we have the socio-historical context in Las Vegas. So the garden, like I said, is located in Las Vegas's historic west side. In the early 1940s, Jim Crow policies made their way to Las Vegas a little later in Southern Nevada than a lot of other southern states. But once they get there, the mayor at the time forced residents and black residents and black business owners to move to an undeveloped part of the city where most of the houses were about like tar paper shacks. You can see here, this is 1942, not that long ago. Most of these houses didn't have running water, didn't have electricity, most of the roads weren't paved, and there weren't street lights. This pattern of the city neglecting the historic Black West Side continues to the present. Even after desegregation, the city has largely had a policy of leave it alone, don't touch it, don't invest in it, and ignore it. And so you can see here, as is the case in many US cities, the coloring is not very good here, sorry about that. But this is a racial dot map. This visually depicts residential segregation patterns, and this area right here is the historic Black West Side. And if you can see, it might be a stretch, there's a great concentration of green dots here, mixed with some orange and a little bit of red. Blue dots that are up around here are white, green dots are Black residents, orange is Hispanic. So even today you can see that the residential segregation patterns map directly onto the Jim Crow segregation patterns that existed decades ago. So this was, again, the historic West Side where residents were forced to move. We still see a heavy concentration of Black residents still there. This neighborhood is also one of the most impoverished in Las Vegas, and it should come as no surprise, it is also one of the most food insecure. So this is a food insecurity map. This is the historic West Side. Again, it's hard to see, but that little number right there says 28.5, which is the highest rate of food insecurity in all of the Las Vegas Valley. So it's in that context where the garden's planted. And so placemaking is a concept that comes from, it's a practice that comes from planning and development work that emphasizes incorporating the surrounding area, the history and the people in the surrounding area, into the planning, designing, and implementation of an urban place that you're developing. And so a related concept is the concept of a sense of place, which on the other hand refers to the subjective and emotional attachment that people have to places like a garden or like a neighborhood. Okay, so as we continue, I want you to pay attention to how well you think the garden that I studied engaged in placemaking practices and what effect that their efforts had on developing a sense of place in that space. So when I talk about community, I want to reemphasize, I'm not talking about a demographic category like the Turlock community or the Stan State community. I'm talking about a concept that encapsulates three principles here, right? Community as involving a shared territory, like a garden space, significant social ties, and we can think here about the concept of collective identity that comes from social movement studies. It's this effort to establish a sense of we-ness between members engaged in collective action. And that's really what this element of community has the potential to create, right? Are these significant social ties that bond members together. And then finally, the last element of community, in my conceptualization of it, is that it involves meaningful social interactions. So any collective action group, including a community garden organization, at some point will encounter some obstacles, at which time they have to make choices. When these organizations, these groups of people make choices, those choices have consequences that locate them on a couple different kinds of continua. So when groups face obstacles, they make choices that eventually influence where they end up on these continuas of how power is distributed within the organization. Do they end up being more centralized power structure? Do they end up being more of a decentralized power structure? Something similar happens in terms of the organizational structure. Do they, based on their choices, end up taking on a more formal bureaucratic organization or a more loosely organized informal grassroots organization? Scholars have found pros and cons for each of these ends of the continuum. What I'm interested in is how does the garden's choices locate them on these continua, and then what are the effects of that? How does that affect their ability to establish meaningful interactions? How does it affect their ability to establish those significant social ties? And how does it affect their ability to create that sense of place that I talked about earlier? So I'll spoil it for you. The distribution of power at the garden I studied was highly centralized. This quote from Sarah, I think, demonstrates the effects of that centralization of power. She said, "I had knowledge or expertise beyond her, the director. But if it wasn't something that she wanted, I couldn't move forward, and so I'd be frustrated. I could do something, but I couldn't take ownership because it wasn't something I believed in necessary, right? And so the effect of the centralization of power at the garden meant that the director took on almost all the responsibility, made all of the choices, and as a result, this left many participants a little frustrated. Happy to help her further her vision, but frustrated in their inability to kind of put their stamp on it as well. The organizational structure, where they fell on that continuum of formal bureaucratic or loosely organized grassroots, it took the shape of a kind of confusing, changing organizational structure. Alex, a volunteer and community service worker, said, "We have everything else here, but we don't have a foundation." You could see in those pictures of the garden, it looks like a beautiful garden. But the volunteers who worked there argued, "We don't have a foundation," and it made them feel uneasy. She said, "We're kind of separated. I do what Roz, the director, says, and then I do what Jimmy, one of our core volunteers at the garden, says, and when they come together, they don't want to do the same thing." And many different participants described experiences like this, where they didn't know what to expect day to day and what was going on, who to talk to, who was in charge, how to find out what needed to be done that day, and it left them with a rather uneasy feeling. So, were they able to create a strong sense of collective identity at the garden? My analysis, I argue that this combination of centralized power, all wielded by the director of the garden, and the kind of diffuse changing organizational structure left many of the really committed volunteers feeling confused, frustrated, and stifled in their ability to again, put their stamp on things. This combination also failed to capitalize on the individual expertise that people brought to this project. There were lots of different people from different backgrounds who had skills that were left untapped. Also, the fact that the decisions that were made about the goals and the means to reach those goals were made by one person was experienced by a lot of people as disorienting, frustrating, and disenfranchising. So the garden often promoted itself as the first public community garden in Las Vegas, which sounds great. But this gets a little confusing from the urban sociology literature. So when we talk about public and community, we often use these concepts interchangeably. But public tends to refer to open and inclusive places, ideally. However, community is always about some degree of balance between inclusivity and exclusivity. Who we are as a community is often defined, at least in part, by who we're not. So, when it's described as it's the first public community garden, this might sound like I'm splitting hairs here, but I think this framing of the garden this way helps to see some of the tension that existed day to day at the garden and how the group tried to draw the boundaries around who was part of the intended community. So, no offense to any master gardeners here. The original volunteers at the garden and the director of the garden did try to exercise some degree of exclusionary behavior at the beginning. Most of this was rooted in their apprehension, their skepticism, their kind of sideways glances at folks who showed up to this new garden and tried to share expertise with them. There was a real skepticism towards experts. Admittedly, most of the volunteers did not know what they were doing, but they were adamant about wanting to learn to do it themselves. And so any effort to come in and help them learn how to garden in the desert was seen as an attempt to infringe on the control of the project, to take away the project from the people who started it. This apprehension and this rejection of experts is really well captured by Roz, the director's quote here. She said, talking about the early days of the garden, "Nobody could come in and offer this or that and try to change this direction. People would say, well, we think the food should be diverted here. We think this. I don't give a damn what you think," she said. I said, when was this? The first few months you were open? She said, yeah, like the master gardeners, they almost made me quit. So you can see here the real effort to create some boundaries, right? They are not part of this community. They're not part of this group that's trying to create a garden by the people who want it, right? Even though we don't know what we're doing, we want to figure it out ourselves. So this concept of user-created space is widely shared in the urban gardening literature, that this is a key to success in many gardens, is that the opposite of or the inverse of a user-created garden is a handed-over garden, a garden that's started, created, and then you try to coax a community to come use this. Most of the people who research this argue if the people who are going to use it are the ones who create it, your odds of longevity are much stronger, right? So you can see that there's an effort towards this happening here. However, this early effort is undermined by some other things that happen. Right, so in order for a garden to be sustainable as a true community resource, it must grow from the local conditions and reflect the strengths, need, and desires of the local community. So that's kind of what they're getting at early on at the garden. But when I asked Roz, how did you get started? Like, how did you turn that? I just can't imagine that gravel pit that seems like such a overwhelming thing to look at. And so she told me what happened. She said, I got a U-Haul, I got some day laborers, and we went from one side of the garden to the other, moving it. So from the inception of the garden, this actually wasn't a user-created space. It was a space where she wanted to get the garden started. She didn't have a community yet, so she paid people at Lowe's in the parking lot to come do the heavy labor for her, right? And this is indicative of a practice that continued throughout the garden's history, that success was often measured by how does it look? How much stuff is growing? And oftentimes this meant that throughout the years, day laborers would have to be paid again, according to those who were in charge. So here are a bunch of volunteers coming to do some of the more fun work, harvesting things, planting seedlings. And here is a day laborer who was paid to come do the dirty work of the garden, the weed picking, the clearing out of crops that were dead. And this happened semi-frequently throughout the time that I was there. And so what this does is it undermines that attempt at establishing this place as a user-created space. But by and large, their answer to who belongs here, who is this garden for, was answered by widespread inclusivity. Remember, I talked about the need for inclusivity and exclusivity. More often than not, the garden embraced this wide open, all-encompassing inclusivity. So Roz quoted in a Facebook post, she said, we don't have a group. Everything we do and all that we are and have belong to and are accessible to everyone in our valley. This is great. That sounds really noble. The most rewarding part of this garden is bringing together a community. It doesn't matter what color, religion, or age you are. We all have this common goal of working together. Again, appealing to this idea of inclusivity, right? It's for everybody. Again, I'm going to skip through some of this. So what I found in my time there was that there's a lot of explicit inclusivity. That this isn't just for the historic West Side. There was a real desire to project this message out. We want to appeal to as many people as possible in Las Vegas, so we don't want you to think that it's only for the neighbors in this impoverished, segregated community, right? You all out in Summerlin, Henderson, the suburbs, you can come in here too. So there's an attempt to appeal to as many people as possible. Anyone can come. But what this results in is an unintended form of exclusion, a symbolic exclusion that happens. If it's for everyone, there's not much being done to make it for the people in the neighborhood who are most harmed by the dominant food system, who are most food insecure, who could most benefit from this project. And so there's this attempt to imagine these universal values of alternative food, of universal experiences with putting your hands in the dirt, working really hard out in the field during the day, and the possibilities of these kinds of projects. But there's also really important differences between the folks who were showing up, the folks who were drawn to this garden, and the folks who the garden was trying to appeal to in the neighborhood. So, as the inclusion increased at the garden, the specificity of the goals and the commonality between the people at the site started to decrease. The priorities and experiences at the site started to be more diffuse, more diverse, and less shared, right? That's the part of the community, right? Shared social bonds. And it started to be more kind of atomized. The goals and values and the perceived problem that the garden was trying to address started to become more and more generalized. It lacked specificity. And so the desire to be inclusive eclipsed the desire to meet the specific needs and desires of the people, time's up, of the people who lived nearest the garden and, like I said, stood to benefit the most from its presence. So, I asked Jimmy, one of our core volunteers, a black gentleman who was there almost every day that I was there, said, who shows up? Is it people from the neighborhood? He said, Zippo. I said, oh yeah? He said, once a month, maybe once a month from the neighborhood. He said, from the nearby neighborhood, very few people show up. Another volunteer, Randy, said, very few African Americans are here comparatively speaking. When I come to the garden and I'm out working, it's rare to see African Americans walk in the door. Down below, he says, I'll go home and to my wife, and she'll sometimes just ask me, how many black folks are participating? Oh, just me and Jimmy, right? So this appeal to inclusivity, the practical everyday result was almost no one from the neighborhood ever showed up. It was all people coming from outside the neighborhood. So this inclusivity is perceived as virtuous, and it is. But the exclusivity that's a necessary component to some degree of a functioning community is also perceived as tactically illogical for an organization like this. It seems like you're shooting yourself in the foot, putting up boundaries about who can participate. So as the breadth of the definition of who is part of the community expanded, the depths of the ties diminished. And as the spatial boundaries expanded from the neighborhood out to the whole Las Vegas Valley, the goals started to be more generalized and less clear. So this was reflected in how I heard people, even some of the most dedicated volunteers, talk about the garden. Instead of using language like we, our, us, that you would think in a project where a strong collective identity had been constructed, I heard a lot more of they, right? Talking about the garden as they, or their project, or their ideas, or I don't know what they want to do with this. So these little language cues tell us that people aren't identifying with the project, they're not taking ownership of it, they're not seeing it as theirs. So, to wrap things up here, I want you to walk away from this with an understanding of what I presented today, that community is an ongoing accomplishment. Right? It's not a static category, it's something that is a result of practice, of actions, of certain kinds of communal behaviors. You don't establish a community and then you have one. It's a constant reproduction of those communal ties. There's always a degree of exclusionariness, of exclusion to community. And finally, that community requires that kind of active participation in the stewardship of the project. So I urge you to think about community gardens and other urban agriculture projects, that it's not just what's being done in the project, but how it's being done. What I mean here is how are we doing it together? I want you to think about how community involves this mix of inclusion and exclusion. I want you to think about how community is practice and involves identification with the project and participation. Okay, that's all I've got for today, so thank you so much.